Hi guys, and welcome back to the Brontë Book Club. As always with my Brontë Book Club videos, this video is sponsored as part of my role this year as Brontë Society Young Ambassador. And today I am going to be talking about my favourite book in the entire world, which is Shirley by Charlotte Brontë. So Shirley was published in 1849 and it was Charlotte's second published novel after Jane Eyre, although it was the third novel she wrote because originally she wrote The Professor, but that wasn't published until after her death. So Shirley was a book with very high expectations placed on it because Jane Eyre was such a success, although critically it was a book that was pulled apart and lots of speculation was made about who Currer Bell could have been because Charlotte wrote under the pseudonym of Currer Bell. And that speculation did not end after Shirley was published. In fact, it made the critics go even more wild with trying to guess who Currer Bell might be. When Jane Eyre was published, there was much talk about Charlotte really being a woman and how coarse Jane Eyre was. Even for a man writing, it would have been seen as a very immoral and very bad book for somebody to have written. It was going to pull apart society and influence people to do awful things. And G.H. Lewis, who in fact was Mary Ann Evans or George Eliot's partner, did a review of Shirley after its publication. And in the opening of the review he says, "We take Currer Bell to be one of the most remarkable of female writers and believe it is now scarcely a secret that Currer Bell is the pseudonym of a woman." And then he goes on to talk about Shirley and says that Currer Bell has much yet to learn, and especially the discipline of her own tumultuous energies. She must learn also to sacrifice a little of her own Yorkshire roughness to the demands of good taste, neither saturating her writings with such rudeness and offensive harshness, nor suffering her style to wander into such vulgarities as would be inexcusable, even in a man. So in setting out to write a book as unromantic as Monday morning, as Charlotte says in the opening paragraphs of Shirley, in fact she writes a book that is just as controversial as Jane Eyre, and yet is criticised for not having the passion or the power behind it that Jane Eyre did. And I think often this is why people have an adverse effect when reading Shirley, because I don't think it is as powerful as Jane Eyre. I think it's a much quieter book, but in fact that's one of the reasons that I love it the most. Even though the book was published in 1849, the action in it actually takes place in around 1812, and at the time in Yorkshire the Luddite uprisings were happening. So you may have heard of the term Luddite, and it's for somebody who is against advances in technology, and Shirley talked about the mill trade and what was happening at the time because obviously the Napoleonic Wars were going on, and so trade had ceased and it was a very difficult time for people in trade, and that also made it very difficult for workers, not just because there was less work because there was less money coming in, but also because the advances in technology meant that fewer workers were needed to do the same amount of work. There's a lot of conflict in the book between Robert Moore, who owns the mill, and also his workers and the people in the area who don't want these advances in technology to be made, and so go out and destroy the new equipment he's bringing in. And I think one of the most interesting characters in the book, who doesn't play a huge part but is still there I think for quite a moral purpose, is the character of William Farren. Now William Farren is a mill worker who is out of work because of all the changes that are happening at this time, and I think that he is used as a device in order to show what the perfect worker should be. He's the perfect working class man because he is hardworking and because he wants to see change but wants the change to be right for everyone, and so he's kind of the middleman in the argument. And he is used for this moral purpose because he doesn't go to such an extreme in that he is destroying all this equipment, but at the same time he manages to persuade Robert to soften his ways, because Robert at the start of the novel and at parts during the rest of the novel too is very, very, very against the actions that the Luddites are taking because they're taking his money and his income away from him. And I think that at the start of the book Charlotte takes this to a level that is quite extreme as well. So you have Robert on one side and the Luddites on the other side. And through helping him and making sure that he does get work, Robert is seen as a character who can change. And this comes about really because of words that Caroline says to him. One of the reviews that came out just after the publication of Shirley in the Daily News said, "The merit of the work lies in the variety, beauty and truth of its female character. Not one of its men are genuine. There are no such men. There are no Mr. Helstons, Mr. Yorks or Mr. Moores. They are all as unreal as Madame Tussauds waxworks." I don't completely agree with the latter parts of that statement, but I think it's really quite pertinent that this review focuses on the female characters in Shirley, because I think that they are what makes the book. They are the parts of the book that I remember the most, and in fact Shirley and Caroline are two of my all-time favourite characters in any book that I have ever read. One of my favourite chapters in Shirley is chapter 7, called The Curates at Tea, and it opens, "Caroline Helston was just 18 years old, and at 18 the true narrative of life is yet to be commenced. Before that time we sit listening to a tale, a marvellous fiction, delightful sometimes and sad sometimes, almost always unreal." And the chapter goes on to explore more of Caroline's character. And at the start of the book she is rather reserved, she's very shy, not very outgoing. And then on the opposite end of the scale you have Shirley Keelder, who from her introduction in the novel is referred to as Captain Keelder. She is very commanding in any situation and at times is very nervous and has softer parts to her personality, but she really is the opposite of who Caroline is. And I think one of the genius parts of the book is that Charlotte manages to create two characters who are so different, they are polar opposites, and yet complement each other so perfectly. At the time, the name Shirley was actually a masculine name, and Charlotte talks in the book about how Shirley's father thought she was going to be born a boy, and then actually when she was born female they still gave her that name. And Shirley's name really does reflect how she is portrayed in the book. She is portrayed in many ways as similar to the men in the book, but also I really like the chapters where we see the opposite of this, and I think that's what makes them so complex. And in my last Brontë book club video about women in the Brontes, I was really interested to read a comment saying about how one of you finds the women in the Brontes novels so complex and yet the men aren't as complex, and that's what makes the book so good. And yet it is very interesting that Charlotte does choose to put so much work into her female characters, and yet her male characters sometimes come across as quite one-sided. I can't offer an exact reason why this is, but I do think that one of the reasons that we may feel that her male characters aren't so well developed, and in fact that is an opinion that's been held ever since her books were published, I think it is just because her female characters are so true to life, they are copies from real life images, that her male characters just can't live up to it. And I think if any other author were writing her male characters, you probably wouldn't get the same sense that they were not well-rounded characters, but they're just so incomparable to her female characters. One of my favourite elements in Shirley, and in fact one of the things I think Charlotte talks about so well in all of her novels, is mental health and mental illness. And Charlotte was well ahead of her time in talking about mental health, and even though it wasn't explored to the same degree that it is now, we have far more specific and scientific ways of talking about and exploring mental health now, although of course there's been lots of conversation recently about how we still have a long way to go with that. I think if you read any of Charlotte's novels, what you see is an exploration of what it means to be inside your own head in a way that I don't really see in many other Victorian novels. Many Victorian novels I read explore outward influences on a character, but Charlotte takes her characters and explores their inside lives, what's going on in their minds, what's going on outwardly that affects the way that they think about themselves and the way that they feel. And there's a chapter in Shirley called The Valley of the Shadow of Death, which is an incredibly powerful chapter which explores the way that our physical health is dependent on our mental health. Part of the reason I like this so much is because Charlotte doesn't just confine mental health to the women in the book. She also talks about the mental health of the male characters, and I really like the scenes towards the end of the book where she uses Louis Moore's diary to explore his feelings towards Shirley and their relationship, but also the impact that that is having on his head and his mind. Speaking of Louis and Robert Moore, I don't think I could end this video without talking about the ending of the book, because I think the ending is quite controversial in Shirley, and I don't think it's as controversial as Jane Eyre. But one of the reasons that Charlotte's books are quite criticised now is because of the way that they are ended, and how I think people think that she gives into the story and marries her female characters off at the expense of their happiness. And I think the relationships in Shirley are quite controversial, and I have very mixed feelings on them, especially as Shirley expresses beliefs in the book, particularly in the middle, where she doesn't think that she will marry. She doesn't think that marriage is for her, and yet at the end of the book she gets married to Louis, and her behaviour towards him is fascinating. And actually I think that one of the most fascinating things too is that the characters in the book acknowledge how fascinating it is. There is a scene between Robert and Caroline where they talk about how Shirley and Louis will be, and how they don't feel that Shirley is capable of love, but Caroline sees a different side of Shirley. And I think that Charlotte does manage to convey Shirley's emotions at the start of the book, how she is feeling and how she's hiding her feelings a lot. And part of the conflict in the book comes out of the fact that there are so many misunderstood feelings between all of the characters and their separate relationships. One of the reasons I actually don't mind the ending of Shirley is because I think that Shirley does hold a certain amount of power. For example, she chooses to delay her wedding. She's not sure when she wants it to be. She holds on to her last piece of independence. And there's a line in the last chapter that I'd be really interested to know your thoughts on. And in it, Shirley says, "Louis would never have learned to rule if she, Shirley, had not ceased to govern. The incapacity of the sovereign had developed the powers of the Premier." So she talks about handing over many of her responsibilities to Louis so that he will be able to learn how to do them. And I think it would be really interesting to be able to jump into the book and see exactly how many of those responsibilities Shirley kept for herself and how many she gave away for good to Louis to do. But I don't think we'll ever know. But I do think that part of why that line has stuck with me is because I think it shows something that is very calculating in Shirley in doing so. She isn't just giving in to him straight away, she's really thinking about what she's doing. So I'm not really sure about the ending of Shirley. It's something I read different every time. With every reading I see it in a different light, but if you've read it I'd be really interested in knowing your thoughts. So that was my discussion of Shirley by Charlotte Brontë. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed the book if you have been reading it alongside the book club. I'd love to know your thoughts, particularly on Shirley and Caroline as characters and the different parts of the book. And our final book club read of the year is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Brontë. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. Happy reading!